when White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt and her husband were denied service not because of their actions, but because of their beliefs. What followed wasn't a meltdown, it was a masterclass in dignity. Charleston had always been a city of memory. Its cobblestone streets, its wrought iron balconies, and the way the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and history through its alleys. It reminded Nicholas Riccio of everything he'd worked for. That weekend wasn't just a getaway for him and Karoline. It was a return to one of the few places in the country where tradition still whispered louder than headlines. The Magnolia Tablehouse wasn't just another stop on their calendar. It was where they went after her first televised press briefing. It was where they celebrated the zoning approval for his most ambitious project on the East Coast. It was where they toasted the kind of quiet victories that didn't make the papers but built a life. And now, it was supposed to be where they came back, sat at their regular table near the window and finally exhaled, just the two of them. Nicholas had once considered investing in the restaurant. He admired the structure, the southern modern blend of architecture, the foot traffic from tourists and old Charleston families alike. It wasn't the numbers that stopped him, it was a gut feeling. Something about the way management changed hands too quickly. Places like this need roots, he told Karoline one evening after dinner, not just paint and press releases. Karoline, always razor-sharp and one step ahead, just smiled over her glass of red wine and said, "That's why I married a builder." Now, years later, he sat beside her in their rental SUV, watching the gas lights flicker against the windows of the Magnolia Tablehouse as their driver pulled up to the curb. Karoline hadn't stopped checking her phone the entire ride. She was filtering through a wave of updates from D.C., briefings, policy drafts, and a half-dozen messages about an upcoming interview. Nicholas reached over, his hand resting on hers gently. "Tonight's ours," he said. "Let's keep it that way." She gave a faint smile, but her shoulders stayed taut, her posture straight. That was Karoline, calm, composed, and always ready to defend the administration's message without flinching. She'd been called every name in the book online, and she never blinked. They both knew what it meant to carry weight, his in concrete and capital, hers in message and moment. But here in Charleston, at this restaurant, they weren't supposed to be anything but themselves. The place had always welcomed them. Waiters who remembered their orders, a chef who once sent out a surprise dish just for the lady behind the podium. The couple didn't ask for special treatment, but they had earned familiarity, respect, loyalty. Nicholas adjusted the cuff of his blazer and looked over at the restaurant's front entrance. Something was off. He couldn't place it at first. The lights were dimmer than usual, and the hostess stand inside seemed strangely empty. "Maybe it's just a quiet night," he muttered. Karoline followed his gaze, eyes narrowing. Or maybe something's changed. In that moment they didn't know what was coming. They couldn't yet see the polite smile of Julian Mercer or hear the words that would start a firestorm. All they carried with them was the belief that they had come to a place they helped build, through years of loyalty, generosity, and the kind of respect that used to mean something in America. But in the age of slogans and fear-driven PR, reputations didn't hold the weight they once did. And tonight, the Magnolia Tablehouse was about to prove just how fragile modern loyalty could be. The valet opened the door and Nicholas stepped out first, adjusting the lapel of his blazer as he scanned the familiar brick facade of the Magnolia Tablehouse. Nothing had changed in the architecture. The elegant porch, the flickering lanterns, the cascading ivy still hugging the wrought iron. But Nicholas felt it immediately. It was subtle, but to a man trained to read buildings, people, and deals, the shift was unmistakable. The energy wasn't warm, it was measured, controlled. Inside the glass-paned doors, the front desk stood empty, the greeter's chair pushed back just slightly, as if someone had left in a hurry. Karoline stepped out of the car a moment later, her heels clicking lightly on the stone path, her posture perfect. She pulled her coat tighter around her frame and gave Nicholas a small, knowing glance. "Quiet," she said simply. "Too quiet," he replied. They approached the entrance together, hand in hand, the way they always did, like a unit, equal parts steel and grace. Inside, the restaurant was half full. A few patrons at the bar, two couples tucked into corner booths. The chandelier overhead gave off its usual amber glow, but something about the lighting felt colder than before. It wasn't until they reached the hostess stand that the shift became impossible to ignore. A young man, barely 30, clean-shaven, too rehearsed, emerged from a back hallway carrying a reservation book like it was a clipboard at a press conference. Julian Mercer. Nicholas recognized him from an investors' meeting years ago. Mercer was new blood, polished, connected, and deeply concerned with optics. Nicholas had passed on him then, too reactive, too eager to please the loudest voice in the room. Julian smiled, tight, corporate, and said, "Mr. Riccio, Miss Leavitt, welcome. Thank you for coming tonight." Karoline extended a hand, her smile polite but distant. "It's good to be back." Julian didn't take the hand. He paused, then flipped the reservation book open and stared at it longer than necessary. Nicholas watched him, how his thumb trembled slightly on the page's edge, how his eyes darted to a side hallway as if waiting for someone's approval. Karoline noticed too. Her instincts, sharpened by years at the podium, picked up signals most would miss. This wasn't a delay, it was hesitation. Julian cleared his throat. I just need a moment to speak with the manager on duty. Please, if you'll wait here." "No problem," Nicholas said, voice even, but his jaw tightened. Karoline crossed her arms gently, not in defiance but in awareness. Something wasn't right. From their spot at the host's stand, she looked across the room. A table near the window, their usual one, sat empty. White cloth untouched, glasses spotless. It was ready for them, but no one was bringing them to it. That, more than anything, set the tone. A place that had once greeted them like family now hesitated at the door. And for people like Karoline and Nicholas, people who'd never demanded privilege but had always returned respect with respect, that kind of hesitation wasn't just a red flag, it was a warning. Julian Mercer returned a few moments later, his expression composed but visibly rehearsed, like someone about to deliver bad news he hoped would land softly. He no longer carried the reservation book. His hands were clasped in front of him, fingers interlaced like he'd just walked out of a boardroom and into a public relations disaster. "Mr. Leavitt, Mr. Riccio," he began, voice low but firm, "I'm very sorry, but we won't be able to seat you tonight." The words hung in the air for a beat, the kind of silence that makes heads turn at nearby tables, not out of curiosity but discomfort. Karoline blinked once, no fury, no surprise, just clarity. She studied his face like she'd done 100 times with journalists who smiled as they twisted a knife. "I'm sorry, Julian," she said calmly. "Would you mind repeating that?" Julian swallowed. Well, after recent online attention surrounding your remarks on immigration and education policy, a group of regular patrons contacted us. They made it clear that if you were served here tonight, they would no longer return. Some staff raised concerns too. We're trying to avoid a scene, for everyone's comfort." Nicholas stepped slightly forward, his voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "Julian, I've brought business here. I've booked private events here. I almost signed a deal with your board 5 years ago. You think we're here to start trouble?" Julian raised his hands as if in surrender. No, it's not personal. It's about maintaining a safe space." Nicholas cut in, sharper now. "Safe from what? A press secretary and her husband having dinner at their regular table?" Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You've served us after town halls, after protests, after press firestorms, and now you're saying a few angry comments on Twitter have more weight than years of loyalty?" Her words were crisp, professional. It wasn't a tantrum, it was testimony. Julian shifted uncomfortably. "I was told to offer you the private dining room. No fuss, no visibility, just dinner." There was a pause, a long one. Karoline's gaze turned toward the table by the window. Still empty. Still set. Her voice, when it returned, was low and final. "You want us to sneak in the back, like we're a liability." Julian hesitated. "It's a compromise." Nicholas let out a short breath, half laugh, half disappointment. "No, Julian. It's cowardice." All around them, the soft clinking of plates had dulled. Diners were watching now, pretending not to. Karoline straightened her coat, looked her husband in the eye, then turned to the man behind the stand. "We didn't come here as a political act. We came as patrons. But now you've made it political, not us." Julian shifted again. "I really hope you understand." Nicholas's voice was like steel. "We understand perfectly." And with that, the calm broke, not into rage or theatrics, but into something far more unsettling: cold, righteous stillness. Not the silence of people who had lost, the silence of people who had just decided they weren't going to be quiet anymore. Outside the restaurant, the air was cooler than expected for Charleston in spring. The evening breeze swept gently off the harbor, brushing past the wrought iron railing as Nicholas and Karoline stood in silence. The glow from the Magnolia Tablehouse still flickered behind them, but it felt distant now, like a place they no longer belonged to. Karoline didn't speak right away. She leaned slightly on the brick column that framed the front steps, arms folded, head bowed, not in shame but in reflection. Nicholas stood beside her, his hands in his coat pockets, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. He'd been blindsided by shady contractors before, misled in development deals, even betrayed by people he trusted. But this wasn't business. This was personal. This was something else entirely. "You know," he said quietly, "I don't think I've ever been turned away from a place I helped build." Karoline gave a dry laugh under her breath. "We didn't build it with money, Nick. We built it with trust." He nodded slowly. "Exactly." For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of passing cars and the faint laughter of diners inside. The contrast stung. Inside, their table waited untouched, perfectly set, waiting for two people now treated like pariahs. Karoline turned toward him, her eyes sharper now, the way they were when she was prepping for a briefing with hostile reporters. "They think we'll leave quietly, that we'll just take the insult and disappear." Nicholas met her gaze. "They think we're afraid of being seen." She nodded. "But we didn't walk in there asking for a camera. We didn't go in waving a flag. We came for dinner. And they told us our presence was the problem," Nicholas added. He exhaled deeply. "That's the part that really gets me. All the years, all the support, and one social media storm makes us radioactive." There was bitterness in his voice now, not fiery but cold and honest. He had worked decades in real estate and politics-adjacent circles. He understood conflict, compromise, diplomacy. But what he couldn't stomach was betrayal disguised as policy. Karoline reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "You know what they count on?" she asked, her thumb hovering over the camera button. "They count on people like us being too polite to push back." Nicholas placed a hand over hers, gently lowering the phone for a moment. "You sure about this?" Karoline's eyes didn't waver. "It's not about us anymore. It's about what this says to anyone who's ever felt erased for doing their job." Nicholas held her gaze, then nodded. "Then do it, but not out of anger, out of principle." She looked down at the screen, the reflection of her face staring back in the black glass. Then she tapped, "Go live." The moment the live stream began, Karoline's expression was calm, not performative, not enraged, just resolute. The kind of face that told viewers something important was about to be said. Her voice, low and precise, cut through the evening noise like a well-placed opening statement in court. "Good evening," she began, holding her phone steady. "My name is Karoline Leavitt. I'm the White House press secretary, and tonight in Charleston, South Carolina, my husband and I were refused service at the Magnolia Tablehouse, not because we were late, not because we caused a scene, but because of my political affiliation." Nicholas stood just behind her, arms crossed, face unreadable. He wasn't there to make noise, he was there to stand firm, to show that when one of them was pushed, both stood their ground. Karoline continued, her words measured and deliberate. "This restaurant has served us for years, through good times and hard times, but tonight we were told behind closed doors that our presence, mine specifically, made others uncomfortable, that we were a risk." She paused just long enough for the message to land. "Let me be clear, we didn't come here for politics, we came for dinner. What we got instead was discrimination dressed in etiquette. Within seconds, the view count began to climb. Comments began to pour in, some supportive, some skeptical, but most just listened, because it wasn't a rant. It wasn't a meltdown. It was a woman stating her case, with the poise of someone who knew exactly how this would be twisted and didn't care. The truth spoke for itself. Inside the restaurant, staff began to glance toward the door. A few diners noticed the phone, the subtle tension in the air. Kaylee Monroe, a waitress in her 20s, quietly stepped to the side of the entrance, watching with a mix of guilt and admiration. She knew what had happened wasn't right, but she also knew that speaking up inside could cost her the job she relied on. Karoline turned slightly, showing the restaurant in the background, the entrance, the host stand. "This is the table we've dined at for years," she said, gesturing toward the window beyond the glass. "And now we're being told we're not welcome here? Because I do my job. Because I speak on behalf of an administration that some people disagree with?" Nicholas stepped forward, not to interrupt, but to reinforce. "They told us we could sit in a private room, so no one would see us, as if we're a problem to be hidden." The live stream swelled past 100,000 views in less than 5 minutes. Karoline looked back at the screen, her tone steady, unwavering. "This isn't inclusion, it's cowardice. And if silence is what they expected from us, they chose the wrong couple." And with that, the tide began to turn. Inside the Magnolia Tablehouse, Julian Mercer stood at the hostess stand like a man trying to hold a sandcastle together as the tide rolled in. From behind the bar, servers and kitchen staff began murmuring. The tension wasn't just at the door anymore, it was bleeding into the dining room. And all eyes were shifting toward the entrance, toward the woman holding her phone steady, calmly describing what had just taken place. It wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional, that's what made it hit harder. In the kitchen, Chef Reuben Holt had been watching the entire time on a staff member's phone. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, Holt had spent 2 decades behind those swinging doors. He'd cooked for governors, veterans, and at least 3 generations of Charleston families, and he'd cooked for Karoline and Nicholas more times than he could count. He remembered the night Nicholas had raised a glass to Karoline after her primary win. Remembered the way they always tipped well, always treated the staff by name. They weren't just regulars. They were the kind of people who made you proud to work in a place like this. Reuben wiped his hands on his apron and stepped out into the dining room. Jillian caught sight of him immediately. "Reuben, not now!" But Reuben kept walking. He stood by the front of the house, next to Kaylee Monroe, the young waitress who had already been watching Karoline's live stream, her hands clenched tightly behind her back. "Julian," Reuben said, voice steady, "I've got a question for you." Julian blinked. "Of course. Why are we turning away people who've done nothing wrong?" Julian shifted, clearly not expecting this. "We're protecting the comfort of the majority. We've had emails, threats of boycotts. You know how volatile things can get." Reuben nodded slowly, then pulled off his apron, folded it once, and laid it gently on the edge of the hostess stand. "I served in Iraq," he said plainly, voice just loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "You don't walk away from your own just because things get uncomfortable." Julian's face reddened. "Reuben, you don't understand the pressure." "No," Reuben cut in. "You don't understand what loyalty means. I've made every one of their anniversary steaks in this place. I was here the night we put out champagne for her promotion, and tonight you turned them away to keep Twitter happy?" The room went still, even the forks stopped clinking. Then Kaylee stepped forward. Quiet, unsure, but firm. "I'm with him," she said. "They've always treated me like family. And now we're treating them like a threat?" She pulled off her apron, too. Julian's voice cracked. "Kaylee, please." But it was too late. 2 more servers, then a bartender followed. One by one, they laid their aprons and towels down like flags folded on a casket. Not with rage, with resolve. Karoline and Nicholas stood just beyond the door, still midstream. But now the story was no longer just about them. It was about something deeper unraveling inside the Magnolia Tablehouse. The people who kept the lights on were choosing principle over policy. And for the first time that night, Julian Mercer looked afraid. The hush that settled inside the Magnolia Tablehouse after the staff walkout was the kind of silence that follows a dropped glass in a church. Diners, who had previously pretended not to notice, were now paying attention. Forks halfway to mouths, conversation stalled, wine glasses resting idle. In the center of the restaurant, a man in a charcoal gray suit slowly rose from his table. He looked to be in his early 70s, trim, with silver hair and the kind of presence that needed no introduction. He glanced toward Julian, then shifted his gaze to the glass doors where Karoline and Nicholas stood, framed by the porch lights. "I signed a business deal with that woman at table 14 2 years ago," he said, pointing with one hand. "It was the smoothest negotiation I've ever had. Fair, straight-talking, and honest. Now you're telling me she's too divisive to be served." Julian opened his mouth to reply, but the man didn't give him the chance. "You made a mistake, son. That couple's done more for this community than half the people who fill this place on a Saturday night." A low murmur rippled through the room. Another man, wearing a worn leather bomber jacket and a Navy veteran cap, stood from a booth near the back. "She's the press secretary, yeah," he said. "But more than that, she's always carried herself with respect. Doesn't matter if you agree with her boss or not. You don't treat people like this." Applause broke out, not thunderous, but steady, respectful. A few men nodded across tables. A pair of older couples quietly stood and made their way toward the door without a word, not in protest but in quiet solidarity. But not everyone joined. Near the bar, a woman in a designer cashmere wrap leaned toward her dining companion and whispered, loudly enough to be heard, "She knew this would happen. This is political theater." Her friend nodded. "She's just trying to make headlines." But even their tone was less confident than before, no longer smug but defensive. Back near the hostess stand, Julian was visibly rattled. His eyes darted between the scattering patrons, the servers now gone, and the ever-growing audience outside, both in person and online. The restaurant was no longer a dining space, it had become a courtroom. And the jury wasn't swayed by hashtags or press releases, it was made up of men and women who had lived long enough to know when someone was being treated unfairly and when silence wasn't an option. And in that moment, one truth became crystal clear. The house may have been full, but the foundation had cracked. Karoline lowered her phone slightly, the live stream still rolling but no longer the focus. She looked to Nicholas, who hadn't spoken in several minutes. His arms crossed, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the restaurant as if staring down the ruins of something they once believed in. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His silence spoke volumes. They were done here. But not defeated. Karoline exhaled slowly, her voice low and steady. "Let's go." They stepped down from the porch together, walking not like people chased out, but like people who chose to leave on their own terms. Behind them, the once buzzing Magnolia Tablehouse sat in an uneasy limbo. Staff gone, diners split, management frozen. The lights still glowed, but the warmth was gone. As they reached the sidewalk, Nicholas paused and turned back for a final glance. "We gave them everything," he muttered, "and they couldn't hold the line." Karoline nodded. "Because they never had one." She raised her phone one last time. Her voice was quiet, almost reflective now, but still strong. "To everyone watching, we didn't storm out. We stood up. We stood for what matters. Respect, loyalty, and the idea that doing your job shouldn't get you locked out of a restaurant." Then she ended the stream, not with anger, not with fanfare, but with one final look over her shoulder. Inside, Julian Mercer watched through the glass, expression pale and unreadable as the couple turned and walked into the Charleston night. Karoline's heels clicked firmly against the pavement. Nicholas's stride was slow, deliberate, grounded. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They hadn't made a scene. They had made a statement. The Patriot Grill wasn't listed in any national travel guide. It didn't boast celebrity chefs or modernist menus, but for Nicholas Riccio, it represented something rarer than 5-star reviews: authenticity. The small brick-fronted steakhouse sat just off the Charleston harbor, bathed in soft, golden light from old lanterns that flanked the entrance. When the Cadillac pulled up, Karoline remained silent for a moment, looking through the window. "No velvet ropes, no politics," she said quietly. Nicholas smiled. "Just real food and people who remember who you are, not what the internet says you are." As they stepped out, the door opened before they could even knock. Bo Strickland, owner of the Patriot Grill and a retired Charleston firefighter, came out grinning like he'd just seen family pull into the driveway. "Karoline, Nick," he said, his voice rich with southern gravel. "Heard what happened, saw it live. Don't you worry, you've got a table here anytime, and if anybody's got a problem with that, they can find another place to eat." Bo's handshake was firm, his embrace real. No camera flashes, no hush-hush glances. Just a man who knew what loyalty looked like and didn't need to ask for a press release to show it. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with the soft murmur of conversation, the scent of grilled ribeye and rosemary potatoes hanging in the air. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, American flags hung from corners, not for decoration, but because someone had served. The place felt like it had seen things, weathered things, and stayed standing anyway. Bo led them to a table near the fireplace, a warm glow dancing against brick and wood. "This is where we put the people we trust," he said. "Not the loudest, not the richest, the ones who show up when it matters." Nicholas clapped him on the shoulder. "You always did know where to bet your loyalty." Bo gave a wink and disappeared into the kitchen with an order for 2 ribeyes, medium rare, just like always. As they settled in, Karoline glanced around. No stares, no tension, just nods of acknowledgement, and one older man at a nearby table lifting his bourbon glass with a quiet, "Welcome back." She looked at Nicholas, her expression finally softening. "You know what this is?" He raised an eyebrow. "This," she said, gesturing around, "is what home feels like. Not chandeliers and crisp uniforms, but people who remember you even when it costs them something." Nicholas raised his glass. "To what lasts?" And for the first time that night, they weren't defending their right to belong. They already did. Back at the Magnolia Tablehouse, the evening had taken a turn that no crisis manual could have prepared for. Julian Mercer stood behind the hostess stand like a statue carved from regret. The lights above still flickered softly, the white linens remained untouched on most tables, but the heart of the restaurant had stopped beating. The air, once perfumed with roasted garlic and slow-cooked pork belly, now reeked of unease. Staff were gone, loyal customers were trickling out, and Julian's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. The headlines hit within an hour. "White House press secretary denied service in Charleston," read the New York Post alert. "Staff walk out over restaurant's political snub," reported Fox News. Then came the videos. Snippets of Karoline's calm livestream, Reuben Holt's resignation speech, Kaylee laying down her apron like a flag. The footage spread like a fire started by dignity, not outrage. And it burned fast. By midnight, Boycott Magnolia Tablehouse was trending in the top 3 nationwide. Influencers on both sides of the political aisle weighed in, some decrying the exclusion, others trying desperately to spin it. But the damage wasn't digital. It was personal. The Magnolia brand, once a symbol of Southern charm with a modern twist, had become a case study in cowardice. Julian's inbox was flooded with reservation cancellations. A major catering sponsor for an upcoming corporate retreat pulled out with a one-line email. "We don't align with your brand values anymore." 2 of the wine distributors quietly placed their partnerships on review. The head of PR from a regional bank that hosted client dinners monthly wrote simply, "You had one job, hospitality." But it wasn't just business, the people had turned too. A video clip of the veteran in the bomber jacket, saying "You don't treat people like this," had been shared nearly 500,000 times. Comments filled the threads. Some political, most not. One stuck in Julian's mind, even as he tried to scroll past. If they can do that to her, they'll do it to any of us. Meanwhile, across town, Karoline and Nicholas sat by the fire at the Patriot Grill, reading the same news from a very different table. The screen glowed with headlines and hashtags, but there was no gloating in Karoline's eyes, only clarity. "This isn't about retribution," she said, passing the phone to Nicholas. "It's about truth. The kind that finds you whether you're ready or not." At Magnolia, Julian tried to save face. He drafted a carefully worded statement, filled with phrases like inclusion, balancing safety, and "we regret any misunderstanding." But by the time he hit send, it was too late. His words no longer mattered. The crowd had already decided, and the staff, the real soul of the place, had already left. In the span of one evening, a restaurant that prided itself on sophistication and progressive polish had revealed its spine was made of wet paper. The facade had cracked. The foundation, once built on curated elegance, now sat on a sinkhole of fear. They hadn't just lost control of the narrative, they had lost the very people who gave it meaning. And there's no reservation system in the world that can fill a room abandoned by loyalty. The next morning, the sun rose over Charleston with no fanfare, but the quiet carried weight. Inside the Patriot Grill, the scent of fresh coffee and hickory-smoked bacon lingered in the air. Karoline and Nicholas sat at a corner booth, tucked away from the noise of the world but still very much part of its conversation. The restaurant's owner, Bo Strickland, had stopped by their table briefly. Just a handshake, a quiet "we're proud of you," and a refill on the house. No cameras, no press. Just people who understood what it meant to weather a storm with your boots on and your back straight. Karoline glanced at her phone. The hashtag Boycott Magnolia Tablehouse was still trending, but Stand with Karoline had surpassed it. Her inbox overflowed with messages from strangers, from old colleagues, from staff who'd left the restaurant in solidarity, but she didn't read them all. Not yet. This moment wasn't for public statements or interviews. It was for reflection, for breathing, for remembering why they had stood up in the first place. Nicholas broke the silence first. "You know, we didn't win last night because people clapped," he said, eyes still focused on the coffee in front of him. "We won because we didn't bend." Karoline looked at him, then out the window where the morning light filtered through the oaks lining the harbor. "They thought they were excluding us from a table," she said. "What they really did was give us a stage to speak the truth." He nodded. And the people who mattered heard it. They didn't need to gloat. They didn't need to scream. That was the point. In a world addicted to outrage, they had chosen something older and stronger. Principle, stillness, honor. And in doing so, they had exposed what hollow hospitality really looked like when tested. Later that day, Karoline wrote a single line in her personal journal, something she hadn't touched in months. Sometimes victory doesn't sound like cheering. It sounds like silence after doing what's right. That evening, they'd fly back to Washington, but something in them had shifted, not hardened, not embittered, but strengthened. They hadn't gone looking for a fight, but when it found them, they'd stood their ground, not because they had to, but because it was right. And in that kind of quiet victory, the lesson wasn't about who they stood up to, but what they stood for. 2 weeks later, the polished brass sign that once read the Magnolia Tablehouse was quietly removed from its wrought iron frame. No press release, no ribbon-cutting farewell, just a closed sign and an empty building echoing with the sound of what could have been. Julian Mercer had resigned days earlier, citing health and family obligations, but everyone knew better. The restaurant's sponsors had vanished. The reservation system was frozen. The chef, the servers, even the bartender had all moved on, and so had the public, because once trust is broken, no menu, no ambiance, no apology can bring it back. Across town, though, something different was happening. At the Patriot Grill, the regular crowd had grown. Word had spread, not from marketing, but from mouths that still believed in fairness, in standing tall, and in walking through the fire without lowering your voice. A small brass plaque had been installed in the corner booth near the fireplace. It read simply, "Reserved for those who chose truth when it cost them something." Karoline hadn't asked for it. Nicholas hadn't expected it. but Bo Strickland had insisted. "Y'all didn't just stand up for yourselves," he told them. "You reminded the rest of us what that used to mean." One evening, a young staffer, new to the team fresh out of college, approached Karoline after her meal, nervous, sincere. "Ma'am," she said, "I watched your live stream that night. I've never seen someone stay that calm under pressure. Everyone else just yells these days." Karoline smiled, setting down her wine glass. "You don't need to shout to be heard," she said. "You just need to be right, and not be afraid of being disliked for it." Nicholas looked over, pride in his eyes, but said nothing. He didn't have to. He had always believed in letting actions speak louder than outrage. That moment at the Patriot Grill wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuilding, not a restaurant, but a culture, one that remembered what loyalty meant, one that didn't throw out good people because the internet yelled for it, one that understood inclusion wasn't about exclusion, it was about character. The story of that night in Charleston had faded from the front pages, but it hadn't faded from memory. Quietly, in churches and veteran halls and backyards over grill smoke and folded newspapers, the story was still being told, not just as gossip, but as a lesson, a reminder that principle doesn't age, and that true dignity isn't measured in social media metrics, but in who still shakes your hand afterward. Back at their home in Virginia, Karoline passed the plaque photo in a news article to Nicholas one morning at the breakfast table. He studied it, nodded once, and handed it back. "The restaurant failed," he said, "but the moment didn't." Karoline smiled. "That's what I'll remember." And as the sun rose outside their window, casting gold across the porch railing, they didn't see the wreckage of a fight. They saw the quiet proof that when you stand for what's right, you don't walk away empty-handed. You walk away with your name intact. The story of Karoline Leavitt and Nicholas Rixio isn't just about a denied dinner. It's about the cost of surrendering principle for public approval. In a moment when silence might have been easier, they chose integrity. Their quiet stand against political exclusion exposed a truth that still matters in today's divided culture. Loyalty, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. The Magnolia Tablehouse learned this the hard way, losing its staff, its patrons, and its reputation, not through controversy, but through cowardice. What endured wasn't outrage, it was dignity. Karoline and Nicholas didn't shout or storm out. They simply refused to be hidden, refused to be shamed for their beliefs. And in doing so, they reminded a watching public that real strength doesn't come from being loud, it comes from standing quietly for what's right, even when it costs you. This story is a reminder to every business owner, every community leader, and every citizen. When you betray those who've stood by you, you don't just lose a customer, you lose your character, and in the long run, that's far more costly than any boycott. In a time of noise, the calm voice of conviction still wins.